that are needed for sports clubs and other extracurricular activities. They simply can't meet those needs if they are not allowed to work. And that's problematic, and we need to address that, because we want a state, ideally, that cherishes all children and does not draw a distinction on the basis of where the child comes from or their immigration status in the country. And that's the other problem that we have is the poverty that asylum-seeking children experience while they are in the direct provision system, having to make do with the petty weekly allowance that the government gives them. It's also important that we've had numerous reports from the government, the first being commissioned by the government themselves, reviewing the expenditure on the direct provision system, and they actually found that it is actually cheaper to treat asylum seekers no differently to the way the state treats Irish nationals in terms of accessing public service, as opposed to keeping them in the direct provision system. We had a second report in 2020 by the Catherine Day Advisory Group, which was set up by the then Minister for Justice, Minister Charlie Flanagan. That report was embraced by the government, and they made a number of commitments, and including ensuring that asylum-seeking children have access to a payment equivalent to the child benefit. We're not hearing any news from the government in terms of progressing that. We also had a report in that report, in the same report, Catherine Day report. We had a recommendation on the right to work, which sought to lift some of the restrictions. In fact, it called for the waiting time to be reduced to 3 months. The government has not implemented that. Those are simple things that the government could do today or tomorrow if they woke up and had the commitment and will to do it, but those things have not been done, and that's the problem we are faced with today. And we are seeing a lot of more asylum seekers with their growing needs being placed in unsuitable accommodation, some cases in isolated locations that also add to the barriers that people experience in accessing work. So people might find it difficult, for instance, to travel from the direct provision centre to a workplace in places like Kilbride Army Camp, where there is no access to public transportation. People there have complained that they find it difficult to, find work, and when they do find work, they find it difficult to keep that work. And so we already have existing barriers to accessing employment opportunities without the legal barriers that the state imposes. And this bill seeks to address some of those legal barriers to ensure that everybody who comes to Ireland seeking protection is treated with dignity and is able to live a dignified life. It's very soul-destroying to see other people who live in the same direct provision centre as you. You might be sharing a room with them, waking up and going to work, and you are reminded every day that you are not allowed to work, and you see the improvements that work life brings in their life, in their self-esteem, the confidence that they have, and their self-worth. And you constantly then have that depressive state for some people who aren't allowed to work. And that is very sad that you have a government that finds it very comfortable to discriminate amongst an already vulnerable and marginalised community. And I'll pause then. We might take them questions after.
Thanks, Ben. Bulelani. Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that the government's approach towards asylum seekers is characterised by performative cruelty. It is cruelty designed to centre the issue of migration. It's cruelty designed to problematise the issue of migration. It's cruelty designed to distract from the government's failures in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of cost of living, and instead to focus attention on very vulnerable people who have come here seeking our protection, seeking asylum. That is, above all, I think, epitomised by the absolute scandal that you have over 2,000 asylum seekers, people here who have fled awful situations, be it in Palestine, Afghanistan, Syria, fled to this country seeking asylum, and then the government has heartlessly put them onto the street in tents, and then this performative act of effectively chasing them up and down the canal week after week, and yet giving them nowhere else to go. This is purely performative, and it is abject cruelty, above all highlighted by the fact that there are empty beds in the system. There are enough empty beds in the system for every one of the currently homeless asylum seekers to have a bed inside, safe, away from the elements, which obviously aren't too bad at this time of year, but are going to get bad, but also safe from the unfortunate gangs of racists who have been consciously attacking asylum seekers who are sleeping in tents. It is absolute abject cruelty by the government. And I would make the point that this policy does not make one more bed available for homeless people in this country, no matter where they're from. It doesn't address the policy, the crisis in terms of the health service. It doesn't make life any better for any person who is already in this country. It simply makes life harder and more dangerous for asylum seekers. Another aspect of this performative cruelty is the denial of the right to work to asylum seekers who are here. The government was originally forced to extend a limited right to work to asylum seekers after a Supreme Court ruling in May 2017 that the complete ban on asylum seekers working was unconstitutional. But as Boulelani has outlined, there are major restrictions currently, which mean effectively that you won't get the right to work until you're here almost a year. And the right to work that you currently get is a very restricted right to work. You can effectively only work in private sector employment. You can't work in anything in terms of the state sector, public services, semi-states. You can't, if you're self-employed, you can't employ anybody. It's extremely restricted. And so instead, the government is, forcing people to attempt to live on 38.80 a week, or if they are absolutely homeless and on the streets, another €75 on top of that. As Boulelani has said, an amount that is simply not possible to live on. They are forcing children to grow up in extreme conditions of poverty and with their families not having much kind of agency and ownership over their lives in direct provision centres. They are also denying our society the right to use these people's skills, their talents, their brains, their muscles, to address some of the crises that we have in our society. So again, it is a cruelty that is inflicted upon asylum seekers, and not only doesn't help people who are already here or already Irish citizens, but actively harms them by refusing to allow these people to contribute to our society and address some of the crises that we have. We all know that we need more people to build homes to address the housing crisis. We all know that we need to have more bus drivers. We all know that we need to have more people providing public services. Well, there are currently about 10,000 asylum seekers who are denied even the very limited, restricted right to work that the government grants those basically after a year. Many of those people will have the skills, will have the talents, will have the abilities to assist us in addressing the housing crisis, to assist us to addressing the crisis in terms of public services in all its various facets. So we think it makes all the sense in the world, both from the view of the rights of asylum seekers and from the view of our society as a whole, to say we should, of course, while people have made their application or are awaiting the outcome, we should immediately have them the right to work and for them to be able to contribute. We also think that would result in a real integration in workplaces. It would break down some of the suspicion, some of the fear that can exist, because people will be working side by side with asylum seekers and seeing that these are people just like you and me who want to contribute, who want to work, who want to stand on their own 2 feet. It's actually interesting. I do meet people who have questions, who have fears about asylum seekers, and I often have discussions with people. And most of those people do not know that asylum seekers are denied the right to work. So a conversation would often go, people would raise a question. I would speak about, well, Irish people have historically gone abroad and continue to go abroad, and people will respond to say, well, yes, but Irish people worked. And I'll say to people, but asylum seekers aren't allowed the right to work in this country. And people will invariably say, no, I didn't realise that. And do you support asylum seekers having the right to work? Of course. Because people understand that would actually be a contribution to our society. So I think this is a measure that makes all the sense in the world from every single point of view, from the point of view of integration, from the point of view of the rights of asylum seekers, and from the point of view of the needs of our society as a whole. Just to outline what the bill does, it is extremely simple, extremely short, that you can see. It effectively says Anyone who has made an application for asylum while waiting for a decision and no decision has been made shall be entitled to seek and enter employment or self-employment in the like manner and to the like extent in all respects as an Irish citizen. So the current restrictions and so on would be gone, both in terms of the waiting period and also the extremely limited wait. So it has been lodged with the Bills office. We will introduce it at first stage in the Dáil, probably the first week back of the Dáil, if not the second week, so the week, which I think the Wednesday is the 18th. So either that week or the following week in the Dáil, and we'll be trying to drum up support for it. So, questions?
Thank you, if you put that in the middle. Thank you. Can I just check the numbers? How many asylum seekers do we think are in Ireland at the moment? Do we know? And I know you said you're saying 10,000 can't work, you think?
Yes. So the 10,000 is based on basically an estimate of how many people have come in roughly the last year.
Okay.
Because that's the ones who are restricted from working.
Okay, so 10,000 you can't work.
My understanding. Let me just quickly check. Let me get you an accurate figure.
Yeah, but even if the 10,000 can't work.
Yeah.
And you were just saying there, Bulani, just your own experience. Did you find it difficult? Can I ask where you're from? Did you find it difficult to get work, or your own situation?
I lived in both Clare and in now currently in Kilbride, Amicamp and Wicklow, and both centres don't have access to public transportation, and so it would be very difficult to get to a workplace. It's not just the transport issue; it affects not even work, but also when you have your status and you're having to look for a place. Most property viewings actually happen in the evenings. So if the last bus to the centre is at 5 in Knockleshin, as is the case, or at in Kilbride at 6 from Tala to Kilbride Amicamp, you might find it very difficult to get back to the centre after attending a property viewing, for instance, that's happening at 7 o'clock. So people will have various challenges in different direct provision centres, but also with college as well. Some people are studying, some have been doing language courses, and some are doing some of the trades workshops. So we had people, for instance, being trained to drive a forklift because there is a shortage of forklift drivers in some warehouses, and they struggle with transportations. We've had people having to leave Kilbride Amicamp at 4 a.m. in order to get to work. They have to walk a very long distance in order to get to a place that has a public bus that will take them further on along the journey. And so those challenges remain there and will remain there for as long as the direct provision system remains in place. And it is sad because none of the people who are in direct provision would be drawing maximum benefit from being in a direct provision centre. It is the property owners and the operators of direct provision who are smiling all the way to the bank. If you ask the Department of International Protection Accommodation Services, for instance, the one that runs IPAS, the Department of Children, how much they've spent in direct provision, you will notice that the figure is ballooning every year, and it will keep ballooning for as long as we don't have a long-term solution to the problems that we have at the moment. Because if you remember, by end of 2018, all direct provision centres were full, and in that year there were less than 4,000 asylum seekers in Ireland. And now you are talking about a situation where in 2023 you had more than 13,000 asylum seekers coming in that 12 months period. And so without a long-term plan, we simply aren't going to address many of these challenges that we have of people sleeping on the streets, of people not being allowed to work, and the processing of asylum claims themselves, and in the processing of their actual right to work. We are going to continuously have those problems, and this bill actually eliminates some of that bureaucracy. So if you were, for instance, given access to the labour market on the same basis as an Irish citizen, it would simply mean that you could work in the country as an asylum seeker for as long as you are awaiting a decision on your asylum claim, a final decision on your asylum claim. And that is something that we've called for, something that the government, when they established an advisory group, actually had to consider that. When the right to work at the time was about 9 months, you had to wait for 9 months in order to get access to the labour market. And when we reviewed it in the Catherine Day advisory group, the recommendation we settled on was an extension of the right to work. After 3 months, a person has lodged an asylum claim. And so it's horrendous that 4 years later we're still sitting sitting here talking about it.
And you think right away the person should be allowed to work when they come in?
Absolutely. There is no reason why a person shouldn't be. The only reason that we've ever heard from government is the pull factors argument. But we know that from experience in other parts of the European Union, that's not the case. There are countries who offer a less restrictive access to the labour market. Sweden, Portugal would give you access to the labour market much less than 6 months, while those countries haven't seen, what increase in terms of people coming to seek asylum in those countries after introduction of the right to work. So
you
it doesn't.
think that's the fear that people think if that's allowed, more
coming. That's what we've had in terms of the resistance to extending the right to work to asylum seekers, especially in government. Even when we're deliberating and campaigning for the right to work before the court case, we always had constant pushback. Oh, what if this, means that people will come? I don't believe that there is anybody in Sudan, in Nigeria, in Jordan, in Palestine, who's going through different asylum systems around the world and is going through a rational process of selecting which country offers them the best reception conditions. I don't believe that's the case.
Okay. And can I just ask you something else, both of you? Just there's more protests going on now, this time out in Thornton Hall. Could be the next Coolock, I don't know if I'm jumping there, but there's concerns about the protests there. What's your reaction to that?
I believe we've had more than 200 protests altogether organised in the last 12 months in different parts of the country around migration, and especially before the European elections and the local government elections. And that's problematic for us because none of the things that we hear, we're often called welfare scroungers, and yet asylum seekers aren't actually allowed to have access to the general welfare system. It's pure ignorance. People don't know how the asylum process works. But also political parties and political leadership doesn't know how the asylum process works. We heard from Sinn Féin that they were calling for the medical card, for instance, to be means tested. It's already means tested for asylum seekers. Somebody should have told them that before they made that public announcement. And so things like that actually fuel that sort of ignorance that we see online that is now spilling over into the streets. We need to have responsible leadership when it comes to how we talk about migration. It's not that we don't want to talk about migration. There are very genuine concerns when you are an asylum seeker being stuck on the mountains and don't have a GP, for instance, and you need healthcare. Okay, that's a real problem that I would imagine a person who lives close to that direct provision center would also go through the same process when they're having to wait for an ambulance for 30 minutes before an ambulance arrives to pick them up. That's a real problem that we're not talking about. So none of the issues that people experience, both Irish and asylum seekers, are actually taking center stage at the moment. It's all the waffle about immigration that actually doesn't make much sense. It's not grounded on facts. It's rooted in ignorance. Concern about the protests because for us it means that the people who are on the streets particularly have reported, and we wrote to Minister McEntee about this, reported being intimidated by people who show up with cameras to film them and to post on social media and all the lot. And threatening the language and abusive racial language at times. We wrote to Minister McEntee to raise that, and we haven't heard back from the minister, and that was months ago. And we still have that situation where asylum seekers are still sleeping on the street, and so we're very concerned that it is not being taken seriously. There aren't enough measures being taken by the government to facilitate the integration of asylum seekers. It's important to note that the state also treats asylum seekers with suspicion, and that suspicion has spilled over into our communities. It's not, I wouldn't blame an ordinary Irish person who responds with suspicion too after reading what they read online about asylum seekers, because the state already treats asylum seekers with suspicion. When you get the temporary residency card from the IPO, it says on it, I'll actually get it, I think I have the expired one. I just need to read it for you, because it's very important that people understand the language that the state uses when they are talking about asylum seekers in terms of how asylum seekers are seen, are to be seen, because the text, the actual text in the card, it says There we go. I found it. This temporary residency certificate indicates that an individual claiming to be the person named on this certificate has applied for international protection. This temporary residence certificate indicates that an individual claiming to be the person named on this certificate has applied for international protection. Now, when I was given this, I actually gave them my identity, my passport, and a national ID for my country. I surrendered that to the IPO, but they gave me this, and it says in bold and in red, this is not an identity card. Now, when I go around presenting this looking for work, what is an employer expected to think? So when you have that attitude from the state, it's not really that hard to imagine that attitude spilling over to communities, and we need to change the whole discourse around migration.
How long have you been here?
I've been in Ireland now since August 2015, actually.
So you have the right to work?
Yes, I got my status last year in February 2023.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Where are you from originally?
Cape Town, South Africa.
Just one in terms of the Thornton Hall situation. I mean, I very much agree with Ilani about the responsibility of the government here. I think the government, in a very, very cynical way, has tried to make asylum seekers the problem. I think that's why they've chosen to leave asylum seekers on the streets. They wanted it to dominate headlines in the run-up to the local and European elections. It's why they announced new means tests. It's why they announced cuts to Ukrainians. It's why they announced evictions for Ukrainians. It is extremely cynical right-wing politics. They centred migration, and in a sense it worked for them if you look at the outcome of the local and European elections. In my opinion, Sinn Féin fell into the trap that was laid for them. They went along with all of the attacks that the government was putting forward in terms of asylum seekers and cemented migration as the central issue, as opposed to rejecting that scapegoating and saying the real problem is the government and the economic system, which puts the profit of developers, the private insurers and so on ahead of the needs of people. So I think the government, above all, needs to take responsibility for the current situation that we're in. I think the government, undoubtedly has neglected communities like Coolock over decades. A lack of investment in terms of housing, a lack of investment in terms of public services. That has happened all across the country. Both rural and urban communities understandably feel left behind by a government that simply does not care. The government has then failed to clearly communicate the truth, to combat the misinformation. I've given the example before of the centre that opened around the corner from our office in Tala, where the right wing, the far right, was out with all sorts of crazy lies about 3,000 unvetted men moving into the centre, when the truth was it was 300 families, and the lies were all the way around the world before the government was combating with accurate information, right? So the government is very, very bad at providing information and communicating to communities, and in that context, in that vacuum of an absence of accurate information, and in the context of deprivation, lack of investment and so on, the far right steps into that vacuum and attempts to weaponise people's anger, not against those who are responsible, which is those at the top, but against vulnerable people who are coming here looking for our assistance. I do feel, and I've been on a lot of doors over the last couple of weeks, I do feel there has been a shift in broad public understanding. I think what has happened in Britain and what happened in terms of the Coolock Says No gang being up with right-wing loyalists, alleged killers in Belfast, I think has helped to clarify for people that there are very, very bad actors at work here who do not have the concerns of ordinary people at their heart. They have a definite political agenda, and it's the same kind of agenda as Tommy Robinson, as the riots that we've seen in Britain. So I do feel that there is a growing awareness amongst ordinary people that there's a threat of the far right. But I think I don't think the government is going to deal with this threat, is the truth. I think it is up to ordinary people, organisations like Massey, trade unions, anti-racist campaigners, community groups, to come together and to push back within our communities against the lies that are being spread by the far right, and measures like this to promote a real integration and a benefit for everybody.
I'm just reading, sorry, this is my last one, then I'll stop. Just reading the Irish Times here. They say a massive security operation has been put in place. Steel fences around Thornton Hall. The public order unit is on standby. So, it seems that they're ready this time. Like, what do you make of that?
Well, I certainly think it is. There should not be another building burnt down on the watch of the government. Like, I think it is crazy that day after day there was new fires happening in Coolock when it was obvious that it was a target, right? So I think there are basic security measures that need to be put in place to protect buildings like that from being attacked. I think that is very, very evident. But I would also say that, like, a security response on its own is not going to deal with this issue. You need to counter disinformation, and you need to actually have investment in these communities to deal with the underlying alienation, deprivation, which the far right is able to feed off and then point in the wrong direction.
I think it's also important to note that this happened long, even before the pandemic. We had it in Ruski, in Leitrim. We had it in Donegal, where a building earmarked to house asylum seekers was torched. You would expect that the government would have learned lessons from that and started planning better engagement with communities as well. But more than 5 years on, we are still here talking about having to quell unrest, protests, organizing communities around buildings that are meant to house asylum seekers, which is very sad for people who have come here seeking asylum, because many of them don't actually even know what the protests are about. And so they look when it happens, when the center is already open or when people have already been moved there, it's very sad, because when one of the buses, for instance, was transporting men, I think it was in County Kildare, where you had people blockading the road, and again in County Clare, where there were people blockading the road when asylum seekers were going to be moved there. It was terrifying for them because they had no idea how to react to that. A lot of the people who've come here have experienced trauma in their home countries, but some have experienced trauma in the migration journey. So when you see a protest, I'm from South Africa, for instance. When I think of a protest, something always burns in a protest in South Africa, and so it's not all that new for me when a building is burned. But for some people who don't come from countries with protests like that, that's all new to them, and can be quite frightening, especially for children.
Bulani, you've already spoken to this, but Paul, could I just get your responses to opponents of a policy like this who make that argument that it would be a pull factor for people, and that, at the moment they might argue that we don't have resources for more people. We already have over 2,000 asylum seekers homeless.
Yes, so I think there's two parts of the answer. One is all the evidence suggests that people seeking asylum are driven overwhelmingly by push rather than pull factors. If you look at the numbers coming into Ireland as refugees under the Temporary Protection Directive and international protection applicants, it is driven by global events. So it's true that you had a significant increase in 2022 because that was the year that Putin invaded Ukraine, and you had over 100,000 Ukrainians coming here. The Ukrainians weren't coming here because of the fact that Ukrainians were given the right to work. They were treated like basically as human beings should be treated. But if you speak to Ukrainians, that is not why they came here. It's good they fled because their country was invaded. The numbers they were down in 2023 when you combine Ukrainians and international protection applicants. They will be down again in 2024, which I actually think is an important. Like, you would have the perception, I think, if you listen to a lot of the media, and I think the government wants this, is that there's just an increase and an increase and an increase, when actually the numbers are coming down from 2022. But again, people would have seen recently the figures about the number of people who are coming here from Jordan. And, these were spread around, the headlines were spread around by various right-wing people saying, why are all these people coming from Jordan? But of course, if you read the detail of the article, these people are Palestinians. So we understand why Palestinians are coming here now. So people are driven by push factors to seek asylum, as opposed to deciding to uproot their life, to leave their communities, to leave their friends, because of, they get the right to work in Ireland. That is not what drives people to seek asylum. The second thing I think is linked to the, you made that point that people would argue, we don't have enough resources for these people. But that is only seeing these people as a burden on our state, as opposed to actually these people are a resource in and of themselves. We need more people to build homes. We need more people to drive forklifts. We need more people to drive buses. We need more people to provide public services of all sorts. So the current system of the government treats these people only as a burden. A burden to be reluctantly and very grudgingly dealt with by giving them less than €40 a week and having their children live in poverty. A very different way to look at it is to say, well, no, these people are a resource in and of themselves if we allow them, which the vast majority of them would want to do, to contribute that. And so you would have a situation where instead of quote unquote being a burden, being a drain to the extent of €40 a week, instead these people would be like adding to our society in all the different ways they can by working. They would actually be paying tax, and so you turn them from being a supposed burden into being an added resource from our society by seeing them in this way, and then by acting in that way by allowing them the right to work.
Okay, and secondly, can I just ask you, sorry, do you want to finish?
Yes, just to add that actually the people who make it through the European Union are an acute minority in terms of what's happening around the world. So if you think about the countries that host most refugees, you think about Uganda, who has more than 1 million refugees, and Uganda is one of the poorest countries in the world. There isn't actually much for Ugandans to go on, but they've welcomed more than 1 million refugees and live there. Again, in Turkey, there are more than 3 million refugees. Colombia hosted quite a lot of Venezuelans who had to flee Venezuela. So UNHCR would tell you, when they look at their global trends, that 4 out of every 5 displaced people actually seek safety in a neighboring country, or in some cases within their own country. So the people who make it to the European Union actually a small part. And so I get very angry when I hear European politicians talking about a migrant crisis, when it was over 1 million people in 2015 who came to the European Union seeking safety, and now they are talking again with the Migration and Asylum Pact about dealing with the migration problem. I don't depart from viewing people as a problem, because in my life in general I like to eliminate problems. So when you talk about people as a problem, you're going to end up with discussions about Rwanda, a type of agreement where you want to outsource your humanitarian obligations to third countries that actually are human rights violating countries themselves.
Thank you. Paul, you've spoken extensively about how people for profit would like to see a left-wing alliance at the next election. Sinn Féin have been included in that, and I know you've raised issues previously around the language used around migrants, the language used around asylum seekers, and the policies there. They've recently launched a new policy proposal on the asylum system in Ireland. I just get your reaction to that, and is that a proposal you would happily stand behind, in government, if that was to happen?
No, I think their policy is very disappointing. I think, unfortunately, their policy is a continuation of the approach that they took in the run-up to the local and European elections, which is where, instead of standing up to the scapegoating that the government is involved in of asylum seekers, they have gone along with it and have said, we'll be even harder. So I was actually looking on their website yesterday, and they have a kind of infographic of where the government stands on international protection and where Sinn Féin stands. And 3 out of the 5 points that they're making are about them being harder on asylum seekers. I think that is morally wrong in terms of our obligation to assist people who are coming here looking for safety, fleeing horrific situations. But I also think politically and strategically it's wrong by Sinn Féin. I think it is like a real strategic error, because it plays into the hands of the government, which is suggesting that this is the problem. Because I believe that if people think asylum seekers are the problem, I don't think they're going to vote for Sinn Féin. I think they're going to end up voting for the government parties or for the more right-wing parties. And so we would appeal to Sinn Féin. And like Bulalani said, parts of what they're saying are just factually inaccurate. So they're leading to the impression that asylum seekers are not means tested for medical cards, when in fact they are. So it's not even an informed position. So I would appeal to Sinn Féin to reverse that position, to defend the right of people to seek Asylum to support us in calling for the right of asylum seekers to work. That isn't a part of their policy that they announced the other day, and to really push back on the idea that asylum seekers are the problem, and to tell the truth to people, which I think they know is the truth, that asylum seekers are not responsible for the housing crisis or the health crisis, for any of the things that concern ordinary people, and all these policies of being cruel to asylum seekers don't make any of those crises any better. And I think we need to collectively push back to the government on that and point out that what they're doing, what the government is doing, is a very disgusting kind of diversionary tactic away from their own failures. So we disagree with Sinn Féin on that. We're continuing to seek a meeting with Sinn Féin to discuss some of these things and to discuss the potential of a left front for the next election. And certainly it's one of those things that we would want to tease out in terms of what would be the position of what would be the common position of such a left front in the next general election.
Can I just ask Massey's position on Sinn Féin's recent policy proposals as well?
We generally don't comment on political parties because we don't engage in electoral politics as a movement of asylum seekers in Ireland. But we do make comments here now and again when people are speaking about us. And we have to. Especially when information is inaccurate. And so we are concerned that the discussion around migration forgets one thing, that the right to seek asylum is one of the fundamental human rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So we expect Ireland, who has signed up to various conventions of the United Nations, but also of the European Union, to uphold those. And any political party that seeks to get into government, we expect that political party to uphold those too. And it's problematic then when you hear discussions around migration that aren't grounded on facts, but also that seek to lower the bare minimum standards that we have for treating people seeking asylum in Ireland. We view human rights standards as a very basic minimum. So some people would like to refer to as the floor, not the ceiling. So when you want to go low, how low can you go? How much more? How much further can you go in terms of imposing restrictions on the lives of asylum seekers? Because at most basic level, we expect a government to treat us no differently to the way that the people in government themselves, would demand the state to treat them.
All right.